At 2:43 p.m. on a Thursday in October, I thought I understood exactly what I was worth to Norwood Precision Systems. 22 years. That's how long I'd been there. Longer than most of the buildings in our industrial park had been standing. Started as a junior account manager fresh out of Ryerson, back when the company was still running fax machines and doing handshake deals over lunch at the Royal York. I'd watched 3 CEOs come and go. I'd survived 2 recessions, a pandemic and a hostile acquisition attempt that nearly gutted the whole operation. And, through all of it, I'd managed to grow my client portfolio from 11 accounts worth roughly $4.2 million annually to 47 accounts worth just under $31 million. My name is Gordon. Wait, no. Let me start over. My name is Ray. No, I keep doing that. My wife says I still can't talk about this without getting agitated. She's probably right. My name is Clifford Marsh. People who know me call me Cliff. 53 years old, I live in Oakville, Ontario, and until 14 months ago I was the Senior Director of Client Relations at Norwood Precision Systems, a mid-sized industrial components manufacturer based out of Burlington. We supplied specialized machine parts to clients across the automotive, aerospace and energy sectors, mostly Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers, a handful of Crown Corporation contracts, a couple of long-standing relationships with American manufacturers who'd been dealing with us since before NAFTA. My compensation package was $318,000 per year. Base of $210,000, performance bonus structure that averaged $85,000 annually over the previous 5 years, plus benefits and a pension contribution. I'd negotiated that number carefully over 2 decades. Every raise was backed by numbers I could point to. Every bonus was tied to retention rates and new contract values. I wasn't paid what I was paid because someone liked me. I was paid what I was paid because I could demonstrate, down to the decimal, what I generated. My total compensation represented approximately 1.03% of the revenue I directly managed. I want you to hold on to that number. The new CEO arrived in early September. His name was Stanton, that's what everyone called him, just Stanton, like he was a brand. And he came in from a consulting background. Private equity experience, someone said. He'd restructured a plastics company in Mississauga and a logistics firm out east before landing at Norwood. The board had brought him in specifically to optimize operational efficiency, which is a phrase that sounds reasonable until you realize it usually means they've hired someone to find things to cut. He was 41, wore slim fit suits, carried a coffee from a place none of us had heard of. In his first 2 weeks, he held one-on-ones with every department head and didn't take a single note I could see. He just listened, or seemed to. I had my meeting with him on a Tuesday. It lasted 25 minutes. He asked me about my accounts, my methodology, my average contract renewal timeline. I told him. He nodded a lot. He said interesting 3 times. When I left, I felt fine about it. I remember thinking he seemed sharp, maybe a little reserved, but capable. I should have paid more attention to what he wasn't asking. The all-hands leadership meeting was scheduled for the 3rd Thursday of October. We did these quarterly. All department directors, the VP layer, a couple of board observers. Usually it was a mix of performance review and strategic planning. I'd been to dozens of them. I knew how they worked. I arrived at the boardroom at the 14th floor of our Burlington office at 2:30. 13 other people were already there. My colleague from operations was across the table. The VP of finance was at the far end. Someone from HR was sitting against the wall with a legal pad, not a laptop, a legal pad, which I noticed but didn't think much of at the time. Stanton started the meeting with some slides about market positioning. Nothing unusual. Then he transitioned into what he called a compensation structure review, which I also didn't think was unusual. We'd done those before, though usually through HR, not in a full leadership meeting. And then my name appeared on the screen, not as a header, not as an introduction. My name appeared inside a table, a compensation table, with my salary broken out line by line: base, bonus structure, benefits valuation, pension contribution, next to a column labeled market benchmark and another column labeled variance. The variance columns next to my name said plus 61%. Stanton said, without looking at me, "This is one of the clearest examples of compensation misalignment we've identified. We're paying 61% above the surveyed benchmark for this role category. That's not sustainable from a cost structure standpoint, and it's frankly not defensible to the board." 14 people in that room. 3 of them were people I'd hired. One of them was someone whose mortgage I'd co-signed a reference letter for. Two were people I'd personally brought back from the brink of being let go by arguing for them to the previous CEO. All 14 of them were now looking at a slide that had my full compensation package on it. I remember the specific sensation in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to the feeling of stepping on ice you thought was solid and hearing it crack under your foot. That microsecond of recalibration where your body understands something before your brain catches up. I said, "Can you walk me through the benchmark methodology?" Stanton clicked to the next slide. Industry standard for a senior client relations director in this region. We used 3 compensation surveys, Mercer, Towers Watson, and a sector-specific report. The numbers are consistencies. Those surveys, I said, measure the role in isolation. They don't account for the specific revenue base being managed, the tenure of the client relationships, or the contract renewal rates. "That's a fair point," he said, in the tone of someone who did not think it was a fair point at all. "But the benchmark is the benchmark. We can't create exceptions indefinitely." I looked at the slide. Then I looked at the room. The HR person against the wall was writing something. I said, "My total compensation is 1.3% of the annual revenue I directly manage. If this were a contingency fee arrangement, that number would be embarrassingly low. Has anyone run a sensitivity analysis on what happens to those $31 million if the relationships maintaining them are disrupted?" There was a silence that had a specific texture to it. Not the silence of people considering an argument, the silence of people who had already been told how this was going to go and were waiting for it to be over. Stanton said, "We appreciate the perspective, Cliff. What we're proposing is a revised package that brings you to market alignment. That means a restructured base of." And then there was another slide with a new number, and the new number was $187,000 base with a performance structure that, even optimistically modeled, would cap out around $220,000 total. A 31% reduction in a room full of my peers displayed on a screen. He kept talking. I heard the words. I understood them. But I was also doing something else at the same time. I was running through a list. A mental list I'd been keeping, without consciously knowing I was keeping it, for the entire 22 years I'd been at Norwood. There was a company in Waterloo, precision manufacturing, similar sector. But they also had a significant contracts division servicing the federal government. I'd had a conversation with their VP of Business Development 8 months earlier at a conference in Toronto. He'd asked me, without quite asking me, whether I'd ever considered a move. I'd said I was happy where I was. He'd said the door was open. He'd given me his card, which I still had in my desk drawer at home. I'd thought about it once, maybe twice. Since then, mostly I thought, I'm 53, I have a good thing, don't complicate it. But sitting in that room, watching Stanton move to his next slide, something about transition timelines, I thought about it very differently. I said, "Can I ask a procedural question?" Stanton paused. Of course. Was this discussion cleared through HR prior to this meeting? Specifically, the decision to present individual compensation data in a group setting. The HR person against the wall stopped writing. Stanton said, "We're operating within company policy." I said, "I'd like that confirmed in writing before we continue." There was a longer silence this time. I stood up. I'm not a dramatic person. My wife would tell you I'm one of the least dramatic people she's ever met. I don't make scenes. I don't raise my voice. I've never slammed a door in my professional life. But I picked up my notebook, I pushed my chair back, and I said quietly, "I'll be at my desk. I'd appreciate a follow-up memo outlining the legal basis for today's approach. In the meantime, I think it's better if I'm not in the room," and I left. I walked to the elevator, I pressed the button, I rode it down to the 8th floor where my office was. I sat at my desk and I opened my drawer and I found the business card from the VP at the Waterloo company, whose name was Jeff. I looked at it for a while, then I put it in my jacket pocket. My assistant knocked on my door about 20 minutes later and asked if I was all right. I said, "Close the door, please." She did. I said, "I need about an hour of privacy, and then I need you to pull the renewal documentation on the Beaumont Energy account and the Shawcroft Aerospace file." She nodded. She'd worked with me for 9 years. She didn't ask anything else. That evening, I called Jeff from my car before I drove home. I told him I was reconsidering our previous conversation. He said he was very glad to hear it. I asked if the position he'd alluded to was still a possibility. He said he'd been hoping I'd call. We agreed to meet for lunch the following Wednesday. I want to be clear about the sequence here because a few people in my life suggested afterward that I acted impulsively. I didn't. I had lunch with Jeff on Wednesday. We talked for 2 hours. He walked me through the role, VP of Client Partnerships, overseeing a book of business that was currently at $18 million, with a mandate to grow it significantly. The compensation was $340,000 with a performance structure that had no ceiling. I went home and talked to my wife about it. We sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight going over the numbers, the pension implications, the benefits comparison. She teaches grade 7 in Oakville, so we've always had a degree of stability on her side, but we also have a mortgage. 2 kids, one in second year at Western, one finishing high school, and my parents are getting older and we help them out when we can. This wasn't a decision I was going to make in a parking lot. I asked Jeff for a written offer. He sent it Friday morning. I reviewed it with an employment lawyer over the weekend, which, by the way, was one of the best $200 an hour I've ever spent, and I accepted on Monday. I gave Norwood 3 weeks' notice. The response was interesting. Stanton's assistant emailed me asking to schedule a meeting. I replied that I was happy to meet, but would be seeing my lawyer on any written communication going forward given the events of the previous week. The meeting was rescheduled, then cancelled, then never rescheduled. HR sent me a letter. It was polite. It wished me well. What happened over the next 2 months I didn't orchestrate. I want to be very honest about that. I didn't make phone calls. I didn't send emails. I didn't say anything to anyone that could be characterized as solicitation. I simply started my new role at the Waterloo Company, which I'll call Kessler Industrial, because I'd rather not use their full name, and I did my job. But clients are people. And people pay attention. The first call came from my contact at Beaumont Energy, who I'd been managing for 11 years. He called my cell phone, which Norwood hadn't asked me to return, because it was my personal phone, which I'd always used for client contact, because that's how relationships actually work. He said he'd heard I'd moved on. I said I had. He said he had some concerns about continuity on their account. Said I understood, and that Norwood would likely have someone capable taking it over, and that if he ever needed anything, he knew how to reach me. He called back 3 weeks later and told me Beaumont was moving their contract to Kessler. I didn't seek that, but I also understood why it happened. 11 years of monthly calls, site visits, a relationship that had survived a supplier dispute in 2019 that I'd personally mediated over 4 days in Fort McMurray. When he thought about his component supply chain, he thought about me, not about Norwood. Shawcroft Aerospace followed within 6 weeks, then a mid-sized auto parts manufacturer from Windsor, then 2 more accounts I'd held for over 8 years each. By the time Norwood's Q4 numbers were compiled, 17 of my 47 accounts had transitioned to Kessler. The combined annual value was approximately $14.2 million. Their revenue dropped 29%. I found out through a former colleague who called me in January. He was careful about what he said. We're both professionals, but the picture was clear enough. Stanton had told the board the revenue impact was temporary. A transition adjustment. The accounts would be replaced. He'd brought in a new business development hire from outside at a considerably lower salary than mine, and that hire was trying to rebuild a client base that had taken me 2 decades to build. They hired 2 additional people after that. Still couldn't close the gap. By spring, the layoffs started. Not the senior layer, the middle layer, project coordinators, inside sales reps. 2 people from logistics I'd worked with since 2011. I heard about each one from people who texted me privately. That part wasn't satisfying to hear. I want to be honest about that too. There's a version of this story where the bad guy suffers and everyone cheers and the credits roll. But real companies are full of real people who had nothing to do with what happened in that boardroom, and watching them bear the weight of it wasn't something I felt good about. What I felt was this. I had made a decision. The market had confirmed it. There's something called the McNamara fallacy. My wife reminded me of it after I told her everything. The idea that if you can't measure something, it doesn't exist. Stanton could measure my salary against a benchmark table. He could not measure 22 years of trust, of knowing which client needed a call on a Sunday before a Monday delivery crisis, of remembering that the procurement manager at one of my largest accounts had a kid with the same rare medical condition as my own nephew. And that brief conversation, 3 years earlier, had built more goodwill than any contract term ever could. You can't put that in a variance column. I've been at Kessler for 14 months now. My client portfolio has grown to $26 million. We just closed a federal contract that I'd been laying the groundwork for over 2 years. Work I'd actually started at Norwood, on relationships that came with me. My performance bonus last year was the largest I've ever received. We've started talking about what the next phase looks like. Last month, my wife and I went up to Collingwood for a long weekend. First real break I'd taken in over a year. We stayed at a place on Georgian Bay, had dinner in town, walked along the escarpment. She said something that I keep coming back to. She said, "You're different. You're less careful." I asked what she meant. She said, "You used to be careful all the time, like you were always managing something. Now you just seem like yourself." I thought about that for a while. She's right. For 22 years, some significant part of my professional energy went into managing the politics of being valuable in a place that had only partial visibility into what that value actually was. Reassuring people above me, protecting people below me, justifying numbers that should have been self-evident. It's exhausting work that doesn't show up on any performance review. I don't do that anymore. A few months ago, a younger colleague at Kessler asked me for advice. He's 31, good at his job, just had his first major client retention challenge. He asked how I handled the pressure of knowing that so much revenue was essentially tied to personal relationships that could walk out the door at any time. I told him that's not a liability, that's the job. The whole point is that the client isn't just buying the product. They're buying the reliability, the continuity. The person who picks up the phone on a Friday afternoon when something's gone sideways. The moment a company forgets that and starts treating its relationship managers as line items on a variance report, it's already made the decision that it values the spreadsheet more than the people the spreadsheet is supposed to represent. He wrote that down. I don't know what Stanton is doing now. I heard through a mutual contact that he left Norwood last spring to pursue other opportunities, which is what it says when it doesn't say anything. The board had brought in an interim COO to stabilize the revenue situation. I don't know if it worked. I have no particular feelings about Stanton one way or another. He was a person doing a job with a set of tools that turned out to be the wrong tools for what he was actually dealing with. That's a management failure, not a moral failing. The moral question for me was simpler. When someone tells you, in a room full of your peers, that your decades of work are a cost structure problem, you are allowed to believe otherwise. And you are allowed to go somewhere that agrees with you. The framed offer letter from Kessler is on my office wall, next to a client appreciation award I received 9 months after joining. Relationships follow the people who build them. I didn't know that sentence would become the organizing principle of the second half of my career. But standing in that elevator on a Thursday afternoon in October, riding down from the 14th floor with a business card in my jacket pocket, I think some part of me already understood it. The market just needed a couple of months to catch up.